When it goes about SMEs, this agenda is being widely discussed. Another issue is how to challenge the current developments. What should SME and business do under such realia? How will business approach from the point of the governmental focuses and segments as well as stages to be addressed primarily. This is indeed a very difficult pathway. We are well aware that there is German Malderstamm, that's a sort of some scientific project that will cover the secrets of doing business, why do the business enabling conditions in Germany work, while in Ukraine something yet fails. From the point of development of SMEs in Germany, you will know quite a lot of useful insights. It's not a rare case when Ukraine is associated with IT and they tell about the development of IT initiatives in Ukraine, but will that suffice to develop IT per se and to talk about IT as such? At times we speak about IT as if Ukrainian were a nation of IT, but when you go to Citadel, you will find majority of these IT experts that work for outsourced assignments. When you look into the statistics of the State Statistics Service of Ukraine, you will be able to gain lots of information on freelancers and private entrepreneurs that have already been registered as square entrepreneurs. These are the guys that work under the formula of not that much dodging taxes, but that search for a creative option of self-employment where they're supposed to work for outsourced assignments themselves. Speaking about Ukrainian startups, now the question is whether they belong to the Ukrainian realm. Now we can observe how the pace of their development and growth is up, and speaking about the scale that we have achieved, it is indeed very hard to label them Ukrainian. From the point of criteria that are advanced towards the founders, they are to pay taxes in the country of origin, and their development achievements, they should be classified, recognized primarily in the country of origin, and then more scrutiny should be made against assessing the place of destination where the developments will land and where the maneuvers will be around them later. Speaking about the Ukrainian SMEs, one of the targets in the governmental program for the liberation of initiatives that are undertaken by SMEs, I should say that entrepreneurs today constitute a very large share of the general public, but yet it remains very hard to enter SMEs, Mittelstand in this context, that's a German realia that will appear very useful for Ukraine, since the German economy is indeed rather powerful. We need to focus on a number of bottlenecks that used to be problematic, but now they appear to be quite not that problematic as the case used to be. Now, from the point of Mittelstand, we should discuss Mittelstand in a spectrum of agricultural business lines, for instance, since they're indeed showcases in how business grew from middle level to big business. Quite often we face heritage as one of challenges. At times one or several companies would belong to one founder, but yet we should think of how to transform such business into partnership or association. Another thing is German Mittelstand, and that's indeed critical, works not only in German market. It's not some realia that's foreign to Ukraine. Speaking about Ukraine, most probably 50% of SMEs today work in trade. Oksana Kazakiv will give us more comments on this, since among the studies that struck me proved that the majority of entrepreneurs work far not at national but at regional level. Most probably here we touch upon expectations or entrepreneurs that sell something, and you can imagine only that SMEs that offer these services and commodities in the market will find it difficult because of administrative barriers to enter the national market, rather than to give preference to points of sales and evaluation of such points of sales. They can move forwards and eventually become national champions and conquer external markets eventually. Now, my reasoning for leadership of Germany, speaking about Mittelstand and standalone niches where Germany has won recognition. Vocational training and professional qualification alongside with education are indeed critical. In Ukraine, we continuously prepare graduates in law and this that will serve the national economy. Here we have a representative that will tell us about the real demands of business, since in the course of respective interviews we had an encounter with employees that insisted that competition with Poland and potentially with Germany is in place, and we need to think twice about how to develop this line of business, how to train them, and what is the source of such personnel to attract them to the domestic market and rather attract from the external markets. Speaking about Mittelstand, Mittelstand implies rather production than any other segment of national economy. Programming and IT business do belong to Mittelstand, in my understanding at least. In Ukraine, quite often Mittelstand focuses on trade instead of looking for some other options of manufacturing business. For instance, when it goes about Mittelstand, it's normally family business and niche business. Conventionally, this is for not production of full cycle. This is not an oligarchical type of production that we're accustomed to, where some entrepreneur from a number of oligarchs obtained for a relevantly low price some commodity, and then he intends to develop some vertical line. Horizontal lines are lower in their number, and these vertical lines are normally very narrow. Speaking about the buyers that would need such detail, they will keep up battle for such a little spare part that Mittelstand can innovate and issue. In my personal viewpoint, this is a problem for the Ukrainian enterprises, since not always they have a possibility and spend money for innovations. For the Ukrainian SMEs, that can appear to be rather weird, but for the German enterprises, it's absolutely common. When enterprises have little unit on innovation and development of commodities, they will work over polishing such spare parts, how to make them better. And the result of such leadership is that SMEs work proactively in the foreign markets, and they work for exports. Speaking about statistics for Mittelstand, you will see which countries have more of such representatives, leaders among the member states that belong to this classification. In your materials, you will find the detailed breakdown for the correlation of the general public, SMEs, private entrepreneurs, then small and medium businesses that are aligned with big business. We made cost estimate where there is a division by number of citizens in Ukraine and non-residents as well, and then we received the picture that you can read on the slide. We have a minor stake of SMEs, partially they work for outsourced assignments, partially Some of them were spotted while dodging taxes, but following criteria of quality, the process is rather promising. In Germany, there are quite a lot of businesses that have already been recognized, and they continuously work for exports. Today in Ukraine, we can mark that the Ukrainian SMEs keep lagging behind, and the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine stressed it not only once that micro entrepreneurs are multiple, and we should undertake more initiatives to enable further growth so that such SMEs in the future could work not only for the domestic market but could service the external markets too. At this, I would like to state that brief ideas that arrived to us at this point appeared, far not universal. Per each individual stage, for instance, when there is a shift from micro to medium level, you will find the standalone programs, curriculums and assignments. This means that when you want to aggravate the number of entrepreneurs and when you harness the number of universities, you will see another opportunity to accumulate cash so that transformation of entrepreneurs into large associations of businessmen with the support of business, even when legal agenda is up, meaning when lawyers are supposed to get registered, then the requirement will be to unite as standalone entrepreneurs into common law business association or another partnership, so that legal regulations on how to work under umbrella of new organizational formations will be up. Speaking about capacity that will enable experts, you will find lots of facilitation safeguards under currency regulation means. This will open new doors for consultants and promotion of brand abroad, and the government can facilitate to this initiative too. Another thing that I would like to address is bringing to the ground what we have on paper in terms of developing clusters. For instance, primarily we should focus on medical cluster. What's interesting about that is its closeness from the point of distance to university, R&D institution that can for several hours per day withdraw from their job and spend a few hours in the office using computers and other materials. In this venue, there is a plan to start medical enterprises. Again, this means that in one and the same place there will be scholars and scientists alongside with enterprises and corporate entities augmented, where you will be able to collect a pool of ideas to gain benefit from. Speaking from the point of municipal regulation, we should scrutinize this idea as skyrocketing initiative. Some entrepreneur from outer space that receives no support from underneath, from the bottom of the governmental machinery. Another thing is to develop clusters that will present, for instance, fashion stores. This will be workshops where entrepreneurs will be able to develop the ideas, collections, and then make determination about furtherance of their clothes abroad. Speaking about this type of initiative, the local self-governance assists with the workshops and access to equipment to be able for the persons bearing indeed promising ideas to avail of the current opportunities available on a cluster. Another thing is to support the development of PR that should be run by professional leaders. Whenever in Ukraine you find some promising cluster, there should be a professional, highly competent manager that will coordinate the run of the course of your business. When it goes about medical cluster and textile, there used to be experienced experts in place that have an in-depth knowledge of these sectors. And just on top of that, I would like to dwell on training programs for those entrepreneurs that had some idea of startup and then spent some hours at universities where they were trained in the narrow line, and after receiving training they moved to clusters, and it was absolutely natural to arrange for organic synergy where entrepreneurs could benefit from all the assistance that was required for this initiatives to be indeed flourishing. Speaking about this community that works today for the benefit and well-being of the general public, I should stress that the best manufacturer here can act as a candidate for a high stake in the external markets. What has already been achieved in Ukraine has already come up with lots of initiatives where you will find different clusters in multiple number, and infrastructure is characterized with a broad variety. This means that we have all in place, and our challenge today is to develop clusters further on, since we need to see to the role of SMEs that will be promoted and will bring us to opening private businesses where micro enterprises and small business will take up some economy of scale approach, where exports of commodities and services abroad will be possible. Well, it's for not everything. Later we will have Q&A session about maneuvers in the market of Ukraine for SMEs and how to become global champions, turning from local prize winners to the global recognized names.
When my colleagues and I visited the German clusters to see how SMEs were supported in Germany and what support policy was implemented in the country, the first thing that fascinated me, which Dmitro pointed out as well, is that for every subtype of small enterprise, from the stage of the establishment of the business down to the small businesses that start exporting, each of these businesses call for measures to facilitate their development. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Within the Ukrainian context, it would be worth remembering that historically Ukrainian micro and mini enterprises have had two functions. One function was creating new jobs, so the social function. If we look back at Ukrainian history, this is something that kept the country afloat in the late 90s. And number two is there is a significant share of the micro businesses and small businesses that are in the service economy and that are in the retail economy. On the other hand, small businesses should become the driver for economic growth, because it is able to quickly adapt to changes, and there's a lot of potential in small enterprises. These two types of businesses, micro businesses and small businesses, should be approached differently. I've prepared a slide. These are the results of a question about expected reforms. We conduct quarterly polls of the heads of industrial companies, and we ask them, what do you think the state should do in this to improve your life? This is the data we got in February. On the left, you could see a large graph with the reforms that SME, small enterprise owners, expect. And the first three measures clearly indicate what small industrial businesses, so not service providing companies, but they expect the simplification of regulation on behalf of the state. They expect tax reform. They expect the creation of regulation, and this is of course connected with their competencies. If you are a small enterprise and you focus on the production of goods, you are limited in resources, and what you need is a clear format, something that is easy to understand. Small businesses want to improve the regulatory framework in Ukraine. Medium enterprises also focus on the simplification of taxation and the decrease of taxation, but here we see that they also want to see the compensation of interest rates, and they want to see the development of e-government. The situation is a bit different for large enterprises. The results this year was a bit unexpected. They expected state support for the industrial sector among large companies, and we have seen these beliefs expressed for the past 2 years as well. Small enterprises expect state support half as much as large enterprises do, and governance is also in fourth place. In small enterprises, only 20% believe they need state support This data can tell you what small, medium, and large enterprises care about. We want small businesses to become the driving force of economic change. To do this, we need to introduce innovative measures, but that is not on the agenda. The agenda right now is the regulatory framework. In the short term, this is what the state should focus on. However, we understand that the more we know, the more we understand what we do not yet know. To facilitate the development and growth of small business, we need to look long term. We need to turn small businesses not only into a job creating force, but also into a driver of economic development. What Dmytro mentioned, I think, would be very pertinent, very relevant. Thank you. And now, Svetlana, I would like to ask you, the EBA is considered representative of large enterprises or of international corporations, but I think you would also want to have more powerful organizations from various sectors in these small and medium enterprises. So how do you see the balancing of these interests in your organization, especially given the context of the discussions right now? Do you agree with the ideas of, with the theses put forth in the poll and survey? Thank you. The European Business Association is believed to be representative of large business, Ukrainian and international, but taking into account the fact that most developed countries, the GDP of developed countries, is mostly comprised of SMEs as contribute. We understand the economic growth of Ukraine, and that is, of course, the key goal of the association, to make Ukraine attractive for investment, to make it economically powerful. And the achievement of these goals would be impossible without the development of SMEs. A couple of years ago, to address these issues, the association initiated a project called Unlimited Ukraine, where Ukrainian large enterprises would help Ukrainian small and micro businesses develop. Then we have a lot of educational programs, development programs. This year, along with Raiffeisen Bank, we've established a so-called SME Hub. It is an education platform for micro businesses. On the other hand, it was also very important for us to understand what sentiments the small business harbored, like the investment attractiveness index that we have been tracking since 2008. Last year we launched a similar index measuring the mood of the sentiment of the small business, and last year we measured it for the second time in a row. Now we'd like to share the results of this index with you, and they're somewhat similar to Ms. Oksana's research, where taxation issues are also listed as number one in our study. This year, representatives of Unlimited Ukraine, 900 enterprises, they have, so the index fell down to 2.7 from 3.2 out of 5 as of last year. Compared to last year, it's become more difficult for small businesses to function in Ukraine. 38.5% of respondents claimed they were unsatisfied with the status quo in business, whereas 31.6% companies were fully satisfied with the situation. Last year, however, most businesses were so 45% of the businesses were satisfied, and only 36% had negative attitudes. Over half of the respondents, 53%, are planning to expand the volume of production. They are actively reinvesting their funds, expanding their the amount of people they employ, growing. Half of the business people, 47%, are expecting an improvement of the business climate in the coming years. 65% of these people are planning to hire new employees, and 77% are planning to increase the salaries for their staff. The key issues that concern small business have changed. Last year, most business people said that inflation was the number one problem. This year, inflation has fallen down to number 4, 43% of respondents, but business people are mostly concerned with the high level of taxation. In the previous research, we talked about the level of the social contribution, mentioned by 46%. High level of corruption, 52%. Although the war in the east of Ukraine, 47%. Last year, number one was inflation, 56.3%. The level of taxation, 42.2%. High level of corruption, 41.9%. A lack of professional staff, 39.4%. The current state of affairs is unsatisfactory for most respondents, 65%, although they remain optimistic, but this optimistic can be considered modest and moderate. Companies are starting to lose interest in loans. 13% say it is actually impossible to take out a loan. 52% say that taking out a loan is expensive and complicated. Last year, these figures were 10 and 55% respectively. Another interesting fact, compared to last year, the interest in growing export capacities of our respondents has also decreased. Among the respondents who plan to export abroad, 21% have already been exporting goods abroad, and 22% of the respondents claimed they intended to export, whereas last year this indicator was 32%, so a dramatic reduction. If business people had the opportunity to change one thing to benefit their business, most of them would have changed the level of taxation. Despite the fact that the situation with the sentiment of small business has gone worse, at the latest Global Outlook session conducted by the association, one of the representatives of the Unlimited Ukraine project claimed that the majority has an optimistic outlook on the future of business. They plan to grow, expand, and develop. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Svetlana. Dmytro Robanovich is with us now, the deputy, the deputy of the Ministry of Economic Development. The study presented by Mr. Dmytro, you've read this study, and it says that there is no silver bullet, there is no magic one-step solution to help grow Ukrainian SMEs. On the other hand, people have high expectations of the new government, and they expect quick achievements. First of all, I'd like to apologize for coming late due to issues with traffic in the city of Kyiv. However, in traffic I had an opportunity to read the study, so there is an upside to the situation as well. I'd once again like to apologize because I have very, very little time here, and I need to go practically immediately after my speech to make it for my next meeting. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for carrying out the study, because evidence-based policy, the decisions that are based on facts, that are based on studies, that is our policy, the policy of our team, of the ministry. These are the things we're implementing right now. Of course, implementing such an approach in full will take time, but we want to base our decisions not on wild guesses or hunches, or let's say it's more about we need studies, and this is something we want to rely on when shaping our policies and we're making decisions. Second of all, I really find the decisions that have been proposed by the study appealing, pertaining especially in regards to innovation and issues of financing and issues of collaboration of various platforms and business associations, because SMEs are very diverse, and of course there is no one-size-fits-all solution. That is why I think the bulk of the influence can be achieved through soft power and soft measures, so the state can offer soft assistance. Of course, there are clear issues that we could see, for example, in the doing business ranking. These are very important things that can be improved directly, but in general, you need to initiate more dialogue, you need to foster communication, you need to grow associations, perhaps impose a mechanism of self-regulation for business, and decrease pressure on the private sector. Regarding the recommendations outlined in the study, I find them appealing because when we were looking at the structure and the functions of the Ministry of Economic Development, so the issues of the business climate and developing entrepreneurship, innovations, and investment are a single block in the ministry, because it's very hard to actually tear these topics apart, to split them apart. And it would be great if I could get a copy of your study and to use your study as guidelines for what we have to do with SMEs. In the previous years, I have addressed issues of SMEs and entrepreneurship previously, and I'd like to mention the problems that you talked about, so financing, taxation, the regulatory framework, etc. And I think in general this coincides with the SME development strategy currently adopted by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. We are planning to continue working in compliance with the strategy, and I would like once again to confirm that it's impossible to expect very rapid decisions for the diverse business sphere. So this process will be quick in particular issues, particular spheres, but in general we're going to work thoroughly, we're going to work gradually. I can't call out one or two specific measures that could be used to improve the system dramatically, because again, the businesses are diverse, their issues are diverse. What the key principle that we will use as our guiding principle is conducting regular surveys, regular polls, and I'm super grateful that these polls are being conducted. We can base our policy on these polls, and again, it's about constant dialogue. So I am very grateful, and I appreciate communicating with SME associations, because large businesses are already organized. Large businesses react very quickly to requests. They come to us directly with requests. It is a bit more difficult to communicate with SMEs. There's a wide range of organizations, and you can't always understand if the organization is representative of the interests of SMEs, if they're representative of the entire sector or not. And it's a bit harder to get through to SMEs. That is why, again, I like to stress that we are very open to collaboration, and we'd be happy to hear you out, and we'd be happy to help. That's it. Thank you. I understand when you need to go. Of course, we're not going to go hold you here. But now I'd like to give the floor to Nicholas, our consultant expert. How do you feel about this research, about Dmytro's comment about the position of the Ukrainian government?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. The story of our research collaboration is I think, started 1.5 years ago. I was still a researcher in Mannheim University, and I was approached for a common project on what Ukraine can learn from German Mittelstand, SMEs. And I was very happy about that, because I was already working on Ukrainian issues since 2.5 years. Now I live here since 10 months, so it's a great pleasure to still be in contact with the guys and being here to present this research. Well, most of the things which we found out have already been said by Dmytro, for example, which I very much support, to the cluster issue, that we need more collaboration between universities, research institutions, small and medium-sized enterprises in Ukraine, also in the field of entrepreneurship. I think Ukrainian universities are in general not so well prepared. It's the same for Germany, by the way, so I was kind of working on those fields in Germany as well. Export issues, yeah. We talked about, we were visiting companies, small companies, which we are thinking about going global. I like to share some stories with you when I visited small companies. I'm not talking about 200 employees companies, but about 20 companies with 20 employees, somewhere around Stuttgart or Karlsruhe in some villages. And I was asking them, okay, what are you working for? What are the markets you're addressing? Well, we export 80% of our things. And I say, where? To France, which is just bordering? No. We're working with Korea, the United States, with South Africa, of course, China, etc., etc. So those companies are born global. They are kind of working on the international markets. And this is, of course, only possible because they are highly innovative. So if you ask me about the key success factor of the German Mittelstands companies, of the SMEs, then I would tell you, yes, they are very much thinking forward to improve, always to improve their products, their services. And this is something which we can also more try to push for here for Ukraine. And of course, we have heard it now sometimes, as Oksana said, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for fostering SMEs, but I like the statement of the Deputy Minister that there's a need for more evidence-based policy advice. this is not to say that you all should come to Germany. When I was consulting German ministries, I was going to the Netherlands, we will send people to the United States, we went to China, so we can learn from each other, and everywhere you get some inspirations, as I hope I could give the colleagues here, on tackling specific issues. And last but not least, I want to comment on the point with, is there some vice versa, should we foster large companies or small companies? And when you ask me, talking about companies, German big companies like Volkswagen, Daimler, or Porsche, they are not like fighting with the small companies, but closely collaborating with those small companies. Mannheim is very close to Stuttgart, the home of Daimler, the home of Porsche, and I visited so many small companies in this region which were working for them in R&D very early on, collaborating very closely in the development of the new technologies, was thinking about new developments, e-mobility, etc., etc. So I think Porsche and Daimler in Stuttgart, they can be so strong only because they have all these small and medium-sized enterprises which work with them, which are highly innovative, and only then can the large companies prosper when they have this very innovative and stable SME sector.
To continue on what we were saying, to maybe bring this experience, make this discussion a bit more relevant. Right now we're seeing very heated debates about amending the taxation legislation pertaining to the simplified taxation system for small businesses, and a significant part of this discussion can boil down to the following. Small businesses claim that they are too small, they are unable to pay as much taxes as large companies can pay, and if you force us to pay all the taxes in full, we will fire our staff and we'll go bankrupt. Whereas large enterprises claim that we cannot exist with you on a level playing field because we are forced to pay all our taxes. We can't avoid our taxes. That is why we would like you to pay the taxes as well. And this discussion is, of course, very sensitive, and it is one of the key discussions in Ukraine, although it doesn't have a direct connection to the complicated, multifaceted decisions that we are putting forth as a result of the study. But for many people, taxes, it seems like solving the taxation issue would be very simple. Let's free small businesses from taxation. Let's simplify oversight, and let's only collect taxes from oligarchs. Dmitro, I would like to start with you, and I would also like to ask the rest of the panel members, what do you think about this issue? And Nicholas, what is your experience? To what extent does Germany use taxation or potential benefits as an instrument to facilitate SME development, and are these measures really necessary?
You know, on Facebook, I had some insights from Arseny Tunik. He is indeed an exciting blog. Primarily, we talked about the seat, and then we switched to transitional provisions and some exclusions. I believe that in some cases these changes most probably were poorly communicated, and partially SME was scared because of such transformations, and that this most probably it makes sense to discuss not that much the national economy but the transitional economies at large, so that we could pressurize less. When you talk to them, it will be impossible to work on the monopoly of one leader in the market, but when you conduct online check and you will see that one button works, that proves that after the first button there will be other buttons turned on. The same is about the communicational campaign that should be supported at large. When it goes about outsourcing, this practice competes with that of Poland. In Poland, the taxes are higher, but the social responsibility and guarantees appear to be better there. Revenue is perceived as a compensation for an ability to live in the country where social services are secured at proper level, but again, the latter point is not to confuse the status of private entrepreneurs with those of hairdressers, where you have suggestion into the market, or when some logistics company or market leader, for instance, that turns in lots of sport clubs and registers more than 100 private entrepreneurs under its umbrella, you will see that competition will be high from the point of honest salaries that are labeled as white salaries. On the other hand, there will be other companies that from the point of rendering services will act as a provider that will suggest some commodities with 5 or 50% surplus. It goes not that much about support SMEs or non-availability, absence of such support or registration of entrepreneurs that should work honestly and that should receive white salaries. Fiscally, revenues in the public sector is not my domain.
I have to say I'm not a big expert about taxation, although I wrote my master's thesis on taxation, but that was more than 10 years ago. But I have to say, I mean, with regard to Germany, I understand you are asking about tax breaks. I know that there are some tax breaks for entrepreneurs in the very early years. But I think we shouldn't put too much into the tax system and not make it too complicated. I think the best tax system is a very easy one, clearly understandable and transparent one, because if you have something, some built-in things like for small and medium enterprises, entrepreneurs, you want to foster this sector, then there can be very easily also kind of manipulations. So I would say yes, tax breaks for very young companies are a good idea, but then I would go more for targeted interventions, support the small and medium-sized enterprises by I don't know, improving the vocational education, improving the research done in universities, improving the general system for them, like some flats, some consultancies, sponsor clusters, etc., because those instruments are much more like can much more really target the problems which you can identify in some certain industries than tax breaks could, in my view.
Thank you.
Speak about introduction of some tax incentives for standalone straight to the general public. When it gets about involvement of this or that country into partnership with the Ukrainian entities, we make a list of these entities that enjoy simplified system of taxes. On the one hand, we are private entrepreneurs are often in contact for business associations, for instance. And whenever it gets about dodging taxes, the same private entrepreneurs that work under simplified taxation system are also appear attractive for some fraudulent schemes. When it goes about crystallizing the system of current private entrepreneurs, I guess that we need to explore more from the point of making the system clearer and more efficient. Speaking about the settlement, we are all well aware that quite often smuggling and breach of rights for the counterparties on the one and the same transaction are up whenever it goes about securing openness and transparency in operations of private entrepreneur. It's also an advice to have an e-ticket for a private entrepreneur and to work under strict guidance of the Ministry of Finance. Even though now, over the past few weeks, we have a possibility to comment on narratives regarding registration of taxpayers in the circle of the associations that are involved into imports. They occupy variant poses at this. Whenever it goes about special modes for business, meaning small business, one should remember that we should keep in mind how minor business develop normally. Speaking about micro business, it is very flexible, depending on the transformations in the business enabling environment. From the point of investment circle, I would like to state that investors that continuously insist on the cost of regulation that is shown in our study when it goes about regulatory load per one employee. For one micro business, there is only one figure in place that should be evaluated multifold. Again, when it goes about universal approach to one employee, we should keep it in mind that small business and minor business,
to avoid taxation, we want to pay as little as possible, and what kind of person would want to pay more taxes? Of course, I personally would also want to pay less, but when we're talking about creating favorable conditions for micro business, the idea of simplified taxation, which was put forth 22 years ago, a very long time ago, in 1997, by the presidential decree of Mr. Kuchma, these are the simplified conditions for administering. So the first simplified taxation system in Ukraine during the first original stage was 200 hryvnia in 1997 terms, 200, and also a simplified form of accountability and accounting. Did away with all the complicated paperwork of the 90s, and I think that's the key advantage. Now, when we are modifying this here, and I agree with my colleagues, that this system has become a source of injustice because the application of this system in large networks or in companies that optimize, because people talk about optimizing taxation, that is legal. On the other hand, there are companies that, especially when talking about the social contribution, right, and other types of taxes, like labor taxes, staff taxes. Some companies spend money on independent contractors, some people spend money on hired staff, and here, of course, there's a discrepancy. But is it the fault of the simplified taxation system? Is this discrepancy the fault of the simplified taxation system? I think I can give you a clear-cut answer, yet no. Simplified taxation is not to be held accountable for this, but it is the application of the simplified taxation system that is at fault. And I've mentioned this as well, there's a need to have differentiated approaches towards the diverse groups within business, within the business community. I'd like to tell you about the registers and the taxation equipment. It's about about infrastructure. We conducted a very brief survey of businesses outside of Kiev, businesses that didn't support this measure, and they say they weren't consulted and they weren't heard because they have bad internet coverage right now. Nonetheless, the smartphone, their coverage is inadequate, and they are unable to comply with the demands if the infrastructure isn't in place. But if we talk about establishing a large-scale system, in Ukraine this means never. That's my comment. Last question. I'd like to ask Dmitro and Nicholas, but if any of the other members would like to comment, of course, I'd very much appreciate your contribution. So, going from the status quo with the development of SMEs in Ukraine, with the part with the largest discrepancy, what Dnipro showed in exports and the development of medium enterprises, and the distance. So getting from the Ukrainian situation to the German situation, which is Germany is one of the leaders in the world. There's a huge discrepancy right now between the two countries. And there are hundreds of measures that can be taken, long-term, complicated measures to bring the Ukrainian situation closer to Germany. Do you think we have a chance? Do you think there is a window of opportunity for us to plan this accordingly? So the deputy minister, who was with us, had the opportunity to draft an action plan for the Ukrainian government. Is it realistic, or is there a need to find loopholes? Is there a need to find shortcuts like the Kuchma introduced simplified taxation system to give SMEs this impulse? I understand this is a question of a more philosophical nature, but I think it's one that's very important to address. I think that we have the framework of developing SMEs. There are various strategies for SME development that have already been described, but as a researcher, as a sociologist, I can say that we need to decide what segment we're most interested in, and we should start, instead of trying to find a common denominator, we should work on a sector by sector, segment by segment basis. If a particular segment has high development for potential, but there's only 15 entrepreneurs in this segment, then it's not a high priority for us. But for example, if we have the IT sector with 150,000, with 200,000 entrepreneurs, we need to understand what incentives could have them establish their own startups here in Ukraine rather than focus on outsourcing alone. I think that's very complicated. We have 200,000 entrepreneurs, so the fiscal service knows their phone number. We could send them text messages tomorrow asking them a question. Do you want to launch your startup? We have the National Startup Support Foundation, so file an application online and we'll help you. So I think it's about trying to find specific niches. It's about finding a niche that we could incentivize, and then we should take specific measures understanding the needs of these segments. So are they independent contractors and do they need financing and mentoring? We'll give them financing and mentoring. If they're independent contractors that do not know how to register an LLC, they need an accountant and legal aid, let's give them legal aid and an accountant. But let's base it on notion of communication. Why did I mention the text messages? It's not about putting a billboard on the highway or telling IT people on TV about our foundation, but no, it's about giving them a specific offer to a specific segment and targeting via specific channels and having a very clear message. And I think then the system will actually work if we try to address specific issues for specific companies.
Yes, I already said before that I totally agree with you with your approach to find targeted solution for specific sectors. But I like to be a little bit more philosophical if you ask me for that. Yes, of course, Ukraine will not come to the GDP per capita level of Germany within a decade. That will be very complicated, if not impossible. However, Ukraine has lots of advantages also. Ukraine has, of course, some old structures from the past which have to be overcome. But when you look at the young generation here, which I found since 2016, I'm working with young Ukrainians, and now I'm living here, and this is part of the reason why I'm so happy to come here. There's so much potential, there's so much entrepreneurial spirit within this young generation. So just give them these opportunities to grow, which, by the way, I don't see in the German young generation very often. So if you give them this targeted intervention, if you support them with building their companies and growing their companies, I think that there's a very good chance for Ukraine as a country to catch up very, very quickly over the next decades.
I'd like to add, so to take these philosophical questions, I'd like to and say that if we want to target a specific group, this has merit. But it's secondary. The first thing, however, we need to do is take the simple steps we've been talking about for a very long time. So we want to make Ukraine a safe country for business. We want businesses to trust the government. We can't have a Ukraine will never have its Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley is unique. You can't replicate it here. It would be absurd. If you want to work in the Silicon Valley, you can take a plane to San Francisco and work in the US, because the level of the environment in Ukraine and the level of the environment in Silicon Valley are incomparable. And it's a question of whether we should even aspire to become Silicon Valley. But, for example, we should protect property rights and we should protect intellectual property rights when it's safe for Ukrainians to have a business here, to create their own enterprise here. Then Ukrainian advantages can come into play. But then the downside is the insecurity of property rights. When people are unsure whether their property rights will be observed, and intellectual rights are a very pertinent issue in this regard. Svetlana? Yeah, I'd like to comment on this very briefly. One, in regards to communication, to give you a specific example, it is extremely important to communicate appropriately when communicating amendments to legislation and talking about draft laws and government projects. For example, EBRDO, along with the Cabinet of Ministers, initiated a project which the website of which had a clear message to young entrepreneurs. And there was a roadmap regarding what papers, what documents you needed, what permits you needed, stage by stage, step by step. When we talked about this with the members of Unlimited Ukraine, they were totally unaware of this website. So there is a website with a complete step-by-step guide about the measures you should take and your actions you should take. So, of course, targeted communication is extremely important when getting the message across. And number two is this: you need the spirit of entrepreneurship. You can talk a lot about support, talk about state support of various projects, but the experience of the members of Unlimited Ukraine testifies that successful companies are the companies that strive to be innovative. They strive to develop instead of expecting support. And Unlimited Ukraine, on the other hand, will gladly provide you mentorship, will gladly provide you an opportunity to collaborate with large enterprises. And these two things, synergy is extremely important. Thank you, Svetlana. We have time for several questions from our listeners. Artyom. Alexander Borodina. Shoemakers Association. I'd like to thank Svetlana for saying that there's a need to establish a level playing field. We've said that small businesses need to export, but small businesses will never export because it is not profitable for small businesses to grow. If small businesses grow, their level of taxation will increase. We have two systems of taxation that depend on the turnover. We looked at our sewing factory. So if we have the general taxation system, one seamstress would be taxed 6 times as much than when producing these clothes during the simplified taxation system. 6 times as much. Business will not grow. If businesses don't grow, our economy will come to a ruin. Our manufacturing sector will come to a ruin. Ukraine is the country of factories, the country of plants. We don't have free oil here. Draft Law 1053 about cash register, about electronic receipts. In general, the ideology of the law, the knighthood of law, the de-shadification of the economy is very positive. But there are 2 clear faults in this law. Fault number 1. When using a gadget, you can only give an electronic receipt without giving a print out of the receipt. In Europe, if you use a gadget, you still have a small printer that costs $10 and that prints you a receipt. This is the fiscal norm in the EU. The second fault of this law is that it applies to group 2 and taxation to groups 2 and 3 in the simplified taxation system. It is no secret that a lot of the manufacturing sphere uses groups 2 and 3 to decrease their level of taxes. We don't have idiots in this country, so people believe taxes are evil, and people are using legal ways of optimizing their level of taxation. So draft law 1053 makes working in groups 2 and 3 much more complicated, but it doesn't do anything with group 1. But whereas group 1 is the system that is working in contraband, so-called gray taxes on the market. What kind of systems did we establish? Our legislation already has uneven communication on the market, but we, under the guise of de-shadowification, we make the situation even worse. We exacerbate it further. There are a lot of very serious issues, but going back to the topic of getting Ukrainian business global, we need to export goods. Oil is good, nuts are good, honey is okay, black metals are good, but what we need to do with all these types of goods have a low added value, and they will never be the basis for the flourishing of Ukraine. We need to export furniture, clothes, equipment, goods with high levels of added value, and the taxation system in Ukraine doesn't incentivize this. On the other hand, I have the floor, so I'll talk. To get we need to get the Euro 1 certificate to get benefits, but the Euro 1 certificate cannot be issued to goods produced in a semi-legal manner. You know what I mean? So if you use the simplified taxation system, right now the situation works until the first police inspection. If our goods ever make it to the European market, Europeans will feel the competition with Ukrainian goods, and they'll ask themselves, why are you Euro 1 certified? Please show your papers. How did you get the raw materials for your goods? And materials are all produced by the simplified system. It is unaccounted for. So legally there are issues, and this is a global problem. It's a large-scale issue. We Ukrainians are smart. There's no idiots in this country. The country is extremely entrepreneurial in its spirit. People want to do something with their lives, but the conditions, not even the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework here is better than in Poland. The taxes are lower than in Poland, but this uneven playing field, because Ukrainians are very cunning, is stopping business from developing. And I have a question. I'd like to hear your comment, perhaps from our colleague from Germany or maybe from Svetlana. And Germany has no equivalent of the Ukrainian simplified taxation system. Nothing like of the sort in Germany. Regardless of whether you produce 10 shares a year or 1,000 shares a year, you are taxed the exact same way. Same thing in France. Thank you. Maybe let's collect all the questions first before giving answers. The National Aviation University, the Department of Financing, Banking and Insurance, Professor Olena Chernyavska. I'd like to ask Dr. Nicholas, a colleague of mine, a question. I'd also like to address my question to the esteemed experts. For 3 years, we have been researching small and medium enterprises in Europe as part of the consortium of European universities in Greece, Italy, Malta, and other countries, while focusing on fundraising for SMEs. Our students have made use of the result of their study. They're writing business plan, they're drafting business plan and pitches, and they're going to... I'd like to ask your question, pertaining to your study. In your financial analysis, did you take into account the challenges that SMEs are facing in the face of the base 3 of the third chapter of the Basel Agreement, Basel 3? Do you plan to include this in your study? And when should we expect to see the results of your study? That's the question one. Question two, I'd like to use this opportunity to ask Dr. Nicholas and our esteemed experts to join our international conference that will take place November 16th and November 14th. We will send you the information about this, and I'd like to invite anyone who's interested to take part in the conference, during which we will look into the financial issues and the challenging society is facing, as well as the question of how we should transform by 2022 in compliance with the Basel system. Thank you. Denis Vistuchin, Ukrainian Lawyer Association. I'd like to say a couple of words that, of course, it's a myth that people say that allegedly large businesses pay big taxes, and small businesses pay small taxes. Look at the examples in Ukraine. The largest taxpayer is the Ukrainian Naftogaz, the oil and gas corporation. They only pay indirect taxes, the taxes they collect from their customers, VAT, excise. Then number two, we have tobacco firms. Same thing. None of these companies pay 5% of their turnover to the budget of Ukraine. None of these large companies do. And that's why if you look at corporations that are operating in Ukraine, like Facebook, Apple, where are all of them? Where are these companies registered? In Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Cyprus, anywhere but here. Every payment you make, every advertisement payment you make is taxed in these jurisdictions. And 5% of this payment will never be paid in Ireland. That's the way the world goes round. I'd like to say a bit about SMEs, in the attitude of SME businessmen in Ukraine and the wishes and recommendations of these businessmen. After the new government took office, they only had one question. They asked, Denis, tell me, do you think they will create the conditions more favorable than the ones in Russia? Do these people understand what's going on? War or no war? Europe, visa-free access, free trade agreement, the markets are open, the markets are closed, but we want the new government to make the conditions here better than in Russia. What does this mean? This means that the tax for physical persons should be less than 18% in Ukraine. So now it's 18% plus 1.5% military tax, but for it to be less than 13% as it is in Russia. For private entrepreneurs to pay a fixed amount of not 100 to 200,000 euros in turnover, but to increase this to 2.5 million to make the criteria for being a small business to $2.5 million it is in Russia. And as soon as we do this, the graphs we saw during the presentation, when 90% is unable to enter the medium business category, as one of the moderators said, that football clubs are forced to open more and more private entrepreneurs. This issue will be addressed. And question number 3, we're working on the free market now, if we have visa-free access, why are we unable to make use of all the advantages of the free market, of the stock exchange? Why is it that we have 50,000 euro limitations, so any Ukrainian citizen has a right to buy real estate or securities abroad? Why do you need to get electronic licenses? Why, in Russia, if you've made your money, if you've paid taxes for your money, if you explain to the monitoring and customs control authority that the money is clean, why are you unable to buy stock of Amazon, Apple, or other corporations? Why can't you buy real estate abroad? These are the 3 things that entrepreneurs are expecting from the new government. And question 2. Thank you. I'd like to thank our guests for making it here from Germany. We understand why the German case is so good, because for the past 25 years, Germany has been showing the highest growth in industrial production in all of the spheres. Their cars are the best, their automotive sphere is the best, their shipbuilding industry is the best, even their clothing is the best. Look at Ukraine, 25 years, we see a constant decrease of industrial production. Nobody is addressing this issue. If you look at the forest we talked about, the lumber that was exported to Europe, that is being exported to Europe, look at what this led us to. If we go to a supermarket, the toilet paper from this lumber is either produced in Poland or in Russia, but not in Ukraine. And I have a question. What does our German guest think? When will this chaos cease? When will the government come to realize that to give a country a future, they need to develop the industry, instead of telling us fairy tales about startups, techno markets, tech parks that don't exist and will never exist? Because the people that work in projects, you know what they do? They take the investment, they find investments in Singapore and Asia, and they sell these goods to America, to Europe, and to the UK, because they find the money where the money is, and they sell the goods where the markets are. Thank you. I think a last question from you, and then we'll get our comments. Same thing for you. Maybe let's keep it to 30 seconds each. I'd like to have more of a recommendation, maybe a wish to give. Could you please introduce yourself? My name is Yulia Blachina. I'm a business consultant for SMEs. We all know that EBA is a club for large companies, and it's quite expensive to become an EBA member. And of course, there are no representatives of SMEs in the EBA, but my wish, my recommendation would be that I've worked at an international company. I know that EBA is renowned for the quality of its events. And of course, regularly you can take part in these events, but perhaps if maybe making the landmark events open for the wider public, for representatives of SMEs. So landmark events like an economic forum and so on. Thank you. On our last question, after which we'll move on to the comments from the panel. Valery Maybard, the Ukrainian German Foundation. I'd first like to thank you for your study. It was very informative, but I'd like to ask you, during your study, did you study the role of business as financing institutions? So the KfW, the the Deutsche Ausgleichsbank, on the development of Mittelstand in Deutschland, because I took an interest in the infrastructure of SME support in Germany, and Mittelstand is associated with the KfW and the Deutsche Ausgleichsbank, established post-World War II. And these two institutions have become the key factor of the German economic miracle, because they not only supported SMEs, but also led to the development of banking infrastructure. And in Ukraine, thanks to the German government, this model was implemented in '95 on the basis of the Ukrainian German Foundation, since we not only provide support and financing through various instruments, but we also developed banking infrastructure. In 1995, no one approached micro and small businesses, but the German government provided banks the technology to provide loans to micro and small businesses, and this was a breaking point in facilitating the development of microloans in Ukraine and the support of small businesses in Ukraine. We've been talking a lot about taxation, the philosophy of Mittelstand in Germany, and I think Mr. Milfeld can confirm this or maybe deny this, is based on the principle you first give and then you take. And these support institutions first provide grants, they provide subsidized loans, they provide credit guarantees, but then once the business kicks off, once the business is successful, once they are developing adequately, then they see how much taxes are paid. And Germany has a 5-year tax break, 5-year inspection break for SMEs. And I think this is a philosophy that should be brought to Ukraine, because in Ukraine there is the basis for this as well. Thank you. We talked about KFR and the State Bank report. It's a good example of a development bank, although we've drawn our own conclusions pertaining to the fact that all state banks should be privatized, but it's important for the source of financing and the special SME programs. And now a lot of funds are being spent by donors, and I think the state will promote these programs and they'll be able to engage as many entrepreneurs as possible, because once again, our problem isn't money. Our financial issues resolved in Ukraine by establishing an SME bank financed by the state budget, and then we'll see in 5 years, no money, no bank. We believe that we should study international experience, and there are a lot of donors who are willing to give money. There is a banking sphere that is ready to give subsidized loans to SMEs, and I hope we'll work in that direction.
Yes, also there, I'm not a total expert on KfW programs, but I agree this is a very specific and very important, also the Hausbank principle, which was for many, many decades one of the core success factors of the German Mittelstand. Of course, it's also important. We didn't tackle it so much here because we had limited space, but I totally agree with you. There were other questions which went to this direction. I'm sorry, I'm very bad with names, but your comment about this tax system, once you belong above a very different kind of threshold, you come from the one to another tax system without being an expert on exactly the legislation. But I was kind of like more or less targeting in this direction, make the tax system easily and understandable, and then don't try to foster SMEs or small companies with taxes, and then in the end you avoid growth. That's I totally agree with that. Although I don't want to comment on specific issues in this law. Another question was from our colleague from the aviation. Unfortunately, she's not. Anyway, unfortunately, we did not look into the Basel III accounts because I'm also not an expert. I don't know if my colleagues are. But thank you very much for the invitation, which I will give you my card later. So please remind me, and I will happily participate in this event. Another comment was your comment with regard to manufacturing, as I understand you, and I totally agree. I don't so much agree with your point that IT is not important, but you can unite the two, and this is like the wave of the future. I mean, old-style manufacturing will not bring Ukraine into the, I don't know, a second half of the 21st century. But what we see now is, as in Germany, we call it Industry 4.0. And this is also a very important thing which can Ukraine, because Ukraine has this very vibrant IT sector and a not so vibrant manufacturing sector, which is decreasing, but which doesn't need to be decreasing, but because you can in the future kind of try to unite those two fields, and this is also what we, as Jia said, try to support in our new programs. Was there anything else or any questions? Any more questions for me? Because I have heard sometimes for our German. No, good.
I'd like to answer your questions first. This is what I started as part of the association. We launched the Unlimited Ukraine for micro businesses and small businesses, and they take part in large association events. It's extremely important for us to hear what they think, and I've talked about the result of the Unlimited Ukraine study results. I fully agree with Alexander. It's extremely important to create added value. Added value is the cornerstone of the development of economic success. So resources, that's great. Resources are what has helped us survive, but it's added value is extremely important. And I'd like to mention Industry 4.0 and the synergy of the IT sector with industry. And I've talked to one of the largest IT outsourcing firms in Ukraine that aren't interested in developing domestically because the Ukrainian industry is not powerful enough and the industry is not a powerful contractor. And it's important for us, for industry and the IT sector to work in synergy to develop added value production in Ukraine. I don't know if a question, I could disagree with you that we need to print e-receipts. I'd like to add, when we talk about a level playing field, you could look at our studies as well. For the past 2 years, a level playing field is not something that Ukrainian business wants, both in small, medium, and large enterprises. It has quite the contrary. People want to get targeted support. So is it a reflection of what's going on in a propaganda type of sense, or is this a result of the high level of awareness among entrepreneurs about how these processes take place internationally? And we can say that yes, state support and protectionist measures, if you think about back to Trump, they are gaining a foothold in the world of free trade. The free trade world we all aspire to live in. We have aspired to live in for decades. But when creating a level playing field, it doesn't mean we should make the conditions work for some parties. I want to be an advocate for SMEs. It would be absurd to put a self-employed person and a large corporation on the same level. They shouldn't operate on the same terms. It's either that rules are simple for everyone and clear for everyone, or it's about keeping simplified taxation or working with self-employed persons, because this relative injustice for those who pay more taxes compared with those who are using simplified systems, that self-employment is the number one factor. So let's separate the self-employed persons from the corporations by creating favorable conditions for micro businesses. And regarding issues on the comparison between our conditions and with the Russian conditions.
5 years we had faced such an issue that for us experts turned out to be a red line that we never cross and that we will never cross. Since the situation cannot be compared to the current reality against that the Russia survives at present. On my part, I would like to state that irrespective of the current developments of the Ukrainian national economy for the 4th year and growth, while the Russian economy stagnates. Speaking about the pace of development, we mark uprise as of 2016, and the current developmental trends are indeed surprising and impressive. Speaking about the materials, please, you are welcome to attend www.kursop.ua. If we have this hard copies materials on paper, you are more than welcome to attend other events that we will hold. Many thanks for all the participants for their inputs. Many thanks.